name is Sed Mathis. I'm the Social Action Chair of Mercer BLSA's chapter. We have our moderator, Dr. Ansley Booker, who is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion on Mercer's main campus. As more people go ahead and come in, I'm just gonna briefly give an introduction of our three panelists. So we have Professor Tim Floyd. He is a professor here at Mercer Law. He has taught things such as criminal law, as well as legal profession, and has expertise in criminal law, issues relating to equal justice, public interest, and legal ethics. We also have attorney Alicia Hargrove. She is a criminal defense attorney. She actually attended Mercer Law in 2013 and 2014, but did not receive her JD from Mercer. We won't hold it against her, at least as far as the internet told me. But she's a criminal defense attorney. And we also have District Attorney Sherry Boston, who is a district attorney in DeKalb County. And just for fun fact, since it is Black History Month, she is one of only 3 African-American district attorneys in Georgia. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our moderator, Dr. Ansley Booker.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us. And again, thank you so very much, Sid and the BLSA chapter here at Mercer University School of Law for inviting us to have this very fruitful discussion tonight. And so I will say in the very beginning, my law is not my background and not my expertise. So please bear with me as I go through these questions tonight with you all. With that being said, I'll start with our very first question. So if I could have each of the panelists to give a very brief introduction of who you are, where you work, and what is your expertise with the criminal justice system, and how has that benefited you? And we can start with Mr. Attorney Floyd.
Well, thanks, Sid. Thanks, Dr. Booker. And it's great to see so many familiar faces, some that I see most days around here now, some I haven't seen in a long time. So that's great. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. It's Black History Month. I've certainly experienced more history than anybody here. I've been around a long time. I've been an attorney for 41 years now. Expertise in the criminal justice system, I don't know about that, but I've worked in and around the criminal justice system for most of that 40 years that I've been an attorney. As I was a public defender full-time for 5 years back in the 1980s. That's my real experience on a day-to-day basis, being in court, representing clients in the criminal justice system. I've been a full-time law professor now for 32 years at several different schools and in a couple of different states. But throughout that time, I've taught criminal law, I've taught criminal procedure a lot, but I've always tried to keep my hand in. And I have represented several persons who were facing the death penalty. I've handled several of those cases back in the 80s on the front end while this prosecutor was seeking the death penalty. And since over the last 30 years, I've represented several persons who had already been sentenced to death and represented them in appeal and post-conviction matters. And so we'll get into the details later, but systemic racism and racial injustice has been at the core of every aspect of the criminal justice system ever since I first got exposed to it about 45 years ago.
Thank you so much. A very extensive background. That's what we'll say. Extensive background.
Good word. Yeah.
Extensive, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to our next panelist, the esteemed attorney Sherry Boston. So again, the same question to you. Who are you, where you work, and what experience do you have with the criminal justice system?
Well, good evening. I'd like to thank Mercer's BLSA chapter for having me here today. It is my honor and privilege to serve every day as the district attorney for DeKalb County. And what I will say is, obviously, as district attorney, I am intimately involved in the criminal justice system. I do want to correct some things from the outset about the number of, since we are in Black History Month, about the number of African-American DAs that are in Georgia. When I was elected in 2017, I became at that time the only African-American female DA in the state of Georgia. And we had at that time 3 other African-American men. So there were 4 of us at the time, and I was the only female. Now I'm glad to report, as the results of growth over the last 4 years and after the 2020 elections, we now have 12 African-American district attorneys across the state of Georgia, and 8 of them are African-American women. And so and your very own DA in Macon, Anita Reynolds Howard, becomes the first African-American and the first African-American female, and I think perhaps the first female DA for the Macon Bibb circuit. So I'm very glad that we've had so much amazing growth in this area, and I think that should be honored and celebrated this Black History Month. So obviously the work that I do every day is intimately involved in the criminal justice system. I've been an elected prosecutor now for the last, I guess this is my 11th year. I've been DA for 4 years. Prior to being DA, I was Solicitor General for 6 years, which is the elected prosecutor responsible for misdemeanor offenses in my circuit. And so I have seen a lot of growth in this area. Criminal justice reform has been an amazing topic of conversation, especially over the last 4 to 6 years. And it has been my honor and pleasure to work with groups like the Institute for the Innovation of Prosecution, Fair and Just Prosecution, and others to really talk about the needs of reforming the system, addressing the issues of systemic racism within the criminal justice system, and looking for ways to heal our communities while also holding offenders accountable and servicing our victims. So I look forward to the conversation tonight. And once again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so very much. I love the fact that you gave us all that data and statistics. So I think I did some quick math. I may be wrong. So I think that equates to about 66% of the DAs are now Black women. I think you said 8 out of 12, correct?
No, we have 49 district attorneys across the state of Georgia.
Okay.
12 of them are African-American. 8 of those 12 are women.
Yes, so 8 of the 12, which is 66% of the 12.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
66 of the 12.
Look, very quick stats and statistics really quickly. But that is an astonishing number, and we definitely are proud of District Attorney Howard. And I think we just saw the election of the Assistant District Attorney this past Friday, or the swearing in, excuse me, not the election, but the swearing in of the ADA. So amazing, amazing. And last but not least, I do want to go to Attorney Hargrove. So the same question to you. Who are you? Where do you work? And what experience do you have with the criminal justice system?
First and foremost, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm truly honored to be on the same panel with the other esteemed panelists today. However, I do want to make some brief corrections regarding my introduction. I am a graduate of the unsinkable Albany State University, where I received my undergraduate degree. However, I proceeded to receive my legal education at Nova Southeastern University, but I did in fact obtain my LLM from Mercer University in the Federal Criminal Practice and Procedure program there that I believe is no longer in existence at Mercer University, but I was able to obtain that in 2014. I initially started off my career as a public defender. I have many years, over 5 years of experience as a public defender, where I started off in the Southern Judicial Circuit, and then I proceeded and transferred to Dougherty County. My specialization was really somewhat of juvenile justice as a juvenile defender, and also I was the drug court or accountability court liaison. However, as of December the 1st, 2020, I am currently an assistant district attorney in the Henry County circuit, in the Flint circuit, excuse me, but in the Henry County District Attorney's Office, I'm currently a new ADA.
That is amazing. I feel like I have connections to everyone, right? So my brother went to Albany State, so I know about the Ram book, right? I'm not pretty sure I'm not doing that correctly, but I did want to make that connection here. In Black History Month, HBCUs in the house. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so very much. So now what we're going to do is go on to our next set of questions here. And this time I'm actually going to start with Attorney Boston, who went second last time. The question states, and I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly here. Excuse me, let me go back. I'm going to start with this question actually is for Attorney Floyd and Attorney Hargrove, excuse me, making that correction there. Racial disparities persist at every level from misdemeanor arrests to executions. Have you or one of your clients ever been affected by this or impacted by this? And again, that question is for Attorney Floyd and then also for Attorney Hargrove. And we'll start with Attorney Hargrove.
Oh, okay. Absolutely. As a defense attorney, especially in the juvenile arena, I have in fact experienced those disparities at a very high level. And to combat those actual issues within the within a criminal system, you have to be a very aggressive advocate for your client and show those disparities. You have to be confident enough and also knowledgeable enough as a defense attorney to, if you have to, create a presentation that shows those disparities within that particular judicial circuit in that criminal system. And I've had to do presentations several times when it came to sentencing for my clients that said, let me give you an example. They would sentence one individual who was an African-American male to 12 months and then sentence another one to probation, and they can go home with conditions. And so I've had to gather up data and information regarding those results coming from the same cases with the same facts and present that to the court and educate the court on the differences of how my client is being treated differently from the ones that came before him or the ones that are from other cultural and ethnic backgrounds.
Yes, I love that, making sure that we are educating the court and showing those disparities, especially when they're disproportionately affecting people of color. Thank you so very much for being an advocate and sharing that with us tonight. So the next question is for Attorney Floyd. Same question. Racial disparities persist at every level, from misdemeanor arrests to executions. Have you or one of your clients ever been impacted by this? I know you said you were a public defender, so I guess we'll leave that over to you to discern.
The short answer to that question is I've never had a client who was not affected by systemic racism in the criminal justice system. And that's true for all of my clients, whoever they were, whatever their background was, whatever their race is. There is racial bias and racial disparity at every level, and there has been in all of the years I've been involved in it. And that does include from misdemeanors, as we were just hearing about, in terms of who goes to jail and who gets probation, all the way up to the area where I've spent much of my time, and that's in the area of the death penalty. In every death penalty case I've ever worked on, the victim was white. That is unfortunately the case in the overwhelming majority of death penalty cases in Georgia. That's just one example of the systemic bias in our system. The US Supreme Court, in a case over 30 years ago now, was confronted with overwhelming evidence of that kind of racial bias and turned a blind eye to it, unfortunately. But it is the case, and that's just one example of how every case in the death penalty system is infected by racial bias, but it's the nature of our system. All you have to do is go to any courthouse and just look at who's lined up in the chains and the leg irons. Go to prison. Georgia's prison population, the last time I looked, was about 62% African American, whereas the population as a whole is just over 30% African American. That's a result. I mean, those are obviously disparities. I think they're pretty clearly a result of bias. So we can talk a little bit more about things to do about that and maybe causes of that, but it's just a brute, blunt, awful fact, but it is true.
I do want to, I know this is not officially on the question docket, but now that you mention it, would you like to share with us like root causes of some of that bias and some of that racial discrimination that we do see?
Oh, my
opinion?
goodness.
Oh.
Short answer, concise.
There's no way to give a short answer to that question. I mean, you'd have to start at least as early as 16, 19, right, to answer that question about why.
Yeah.
But it's a more complicated answer than that. And the legacy of slavery, but not just slavery, what's been called, well, of course, the new Jim Crow system, the Jim Crow system, and then what's been called the new Jim Crow system of incarceration of African Americans for all kinds of reasons that white people didn't go to jail for. And unfortunately, the legacy of that is just all too real today. But then there are also so many other factors in terms of educational discrimination and housing discrimination that lead to all kinds of other issues that also have an impact on our criminal justice system.
Okay.
But
Yes,
I'll
thank
stop
you.
there because there's so much more we could say.
Yeah, there is so much more, and there's so many, compounded factors that go into each and every one of these discussions. I do want to give the opportunity to Attorney Boston to answer. I saw her pop back in, so I don't know if she wanted to talk a little bit about that before we move to the next question.
Your question was, have I ever?
The racial disparities question. I saw you pop back on the screen, so I don't know if you wanted to respond to that question or if you have any thoughts. The question was, racial disparities persist at every level from misdemeanor arrests to executions. Have you or one of your clients ever been impacted by this?
Well, obviously, I don't have clients in the criminal justice system, but as a prosecutor, I recognize and know, and I should say that I started my career as a defense lawyer, so I spent 12 years practicing in the area of criminal defense before becoming a prosecutor. But what I'll say is this, is that exactly what Professor Floyd indicated, the criminal justice system was built on the back of systemic racism. Like it was, as we like to say, the system is doing exactly what the system was created to do. And now what we are recognizing, and those of us that are working in this space, is that we now have to figure out how to move forward with a system that is, steeped in racism. And how do we move forward? How do we get justice for victims? How do we hold offenders accountable? How do we break the cycle of violence in communities when so much of each of those things is built on the backs of racism? And that's what we have to. It's a big job, but I think it is the new discussion that a lot of folks are now having out in the open, where they weren't willing to accept that. Although I'll have to tell you, there's a lot of my colleagues that are unwilling to speak the words that the criminal justice system is inherently and built off of systemic racism. Acknowledgement is the first part of moving forward to solution. If you're not willing to acknowledge a problem or a system, then how can you fix it? So that we are having these conversations is a critical and important first step in the journey to figuring out how we fix it for our future.
I love that. Awareness is the first step. And now that we're here with you, DA Boston, so this question is specifically for you. There has been substantial criticism of Vice President Harris's prosecution record as a former district attorney of San Francisco. What is your take on those criticisms, and do you see implicit racial bias is playing a significant role in the criminal justice system? A little bit more on that, and if so, how can we combat it? I know you said that awareness is the first step in actually having these conversations.
So there's a lot of questions in that one question. So let me start off with Vice President Harris. And let me just say that I've had the distinct honor and pleasure of having a personal relationship with Vice President Harris. And I have for a number of years. And what I can say is those of us, especially African-American women who represent at least African-American women that are chief prosecutors in the United States, represent less than 1% of elected prosecutors in the country. And when Vice President Harris was district attorney in San Francisco, those numbers were even lower than they are now. And so what I will say is, I do think the criticisms of her policies are not fair, in part because when then DA Harris was talking about ideas around pretrial diversion, this was something that was not being done in any offices across the country. She was a trailblazer. She gave us the roadmap for how we could build on that. And so, as an African American female chief prosecutor, I stand on the shoulders of Vice President Harris, because had she not come first and sort of broke those ceilings and barriers with some of her ideas, we would not have been able to implement what we've done in, what I've done in Georgia, what Kim Foxx has done in Chicago, what Aramis Ayala did in Orlando, what Marilyn Mosby has done in Baltimore, what Rachel Rollins is doing in Boston, what Kim Gardner is doing in St. Louis. And if you ask any one of us, we will tell you that we wouldn't have been able to do the things that we've done without then DA Harris. And of course, now she serves as our vice president. And I look forward to what she will bring to this administration, the voice that she will lend as a former prosecutor when we try to tackle these very difficult issues around systemic racism and reforming our criminal justice system. So let me just tell you how one of the ways that I've started to address this issue. When I became DA, there were several things that I wanted to do and on my mind of dealing with racism. And so one of the first things that I decided is that I wanted my entire office to go through implicit bias training. So my office became the first and only district attorney's office in the state of Georgia to require every single one of its 230 staff members to go through 8 hours of implicit bias training. But that was just the beginning of our journey. Once we completed that, we have moved on to other ways that we can address racism in what we do. I'm proud that I was selected as only one of 3 partner sites across the entire country of DA's offices by Vera, who is coming into my office. We have given them access to 10 years of data in order for them to analyze around sentencing and charging and plea negotiations. And we're doing this in an effort to see how race has affected the work that we do with real information. And so as a result of kind of opening my books for them to see, at the end of their examination, they're going to leave us with recommendations of what's working and what's not working. And it will be, the onus will be on me to implement new policies and changes that directly deal with racial disparity and inequity in sentencing, charging, and negotiation in the criminal justice system. And it's these types of efforts that every single district attorney's office in the nation need to take in order to fully start to evaluate and see with real eyes what's happening inside the walls of their offices in regards to race in the criminal justice system. And I'm proud to be a part of it. I'm proud to be leading this effort, but there's just, there are too many elected prosecutors out there that aren't tackling this issue in the same way. So I hope that at the federal level, we can start to see some leadership. And I think we will see some leadership in the Biden-Harris administration to start to make sure that not just on the federal level, but on the local level, we're having these critical conversations.
And thank you so very much for being a trailblazer and acknowledging that, because I do think implicit bias is definitely the first step, but not the only step. And it does have to be a top-down approach to a lot of these issues, particularly systemic racism. So thank you so very much for that. I do want to move to question number 3. Okay, and this is going to be for Attorney Floyd and also for Attorney Hargrove. And we'll start with Floyd. When a case ends unjustly, how do you handle it? And this is as it relates to the client has been discriminated against based upon their race, and it ends unjustly, the case in the verdict.
the short answer to that one is you have to fight back. And one thing about the criminal justice system is if you don't make a contemporaneous or timely objection to anything that you're complaining about, it's going to be waived forever. So if you're a lawyer, you need to have your antenna up. You need to be recognizing where there's bias. And if you do have a legal argument you can make to challenge it. And unfortunately, too many of these issues get waived because lawyers, and it's hard to blame public defenders with the enormous caseloads they have and one case after another to stop and decide, is there systemic bias in the selection of the grand jury this term? Or you know, you're going through jury selection every case for the trial jury, and people look at you funny if you make too many Batson objections, but you've got to do it in order to preserve it and to make the argument. Unfortunately, it can be very difficult to prove racial bias. I just assert it as a fact, and so many other people are. Well, of course, I love the way that Ms. Boston put it, that the criminal justice system is built on the back of systemic racism. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court has made it very difficult to prove a case if what you have is disparate impact. In the criminal justice system, you got to prove very specifically that the prosecutor, or the judge, or the police intentionally discriminate on the basis of race. And our courts are just not very friendly to those kind of claims. And the proof takes a fair amount of investigation and work. And sometimes it's just not possible to prove it. But you got to make the effort anyway, I think, anytime that you can. Let me quickly go back and just, what District Attorney Boston said is so important that I want all the students here to recognize. Prosecutors are the most important people in the criminal justice system. They have the most impact. And unfortunately, many of the discriminatory decisions are made by prosecutors, but it's just the most promising development I remember in a long time, that we have prosecutors like Sherry Boston, like the long list of people she listed in Boston and St. Louis and Chicago and Orlando, all around the country, progressive, reform-minded prosecutors that were willing to tell the truth about racism in the system. And those numbers we heard right at the beginning of this hour about the enormous change just in the elected prosecutors in the state of Georgia. So I've been doing this a long time, and it can get very frustrating after a while. But I just commend Sherry Boston and all the other people like her that have decided to take on the system from that end. And finally, my message to our students is, if you really want to make a difference, people always think I want people to be defense lawyers, and that's what I did, and that's maybe where my heart is. But there is so much room to make a difference for the better in a prosecutor's office. Thanks.
I absolutely agree. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it my time to speak? I absolutely agree wholeheartedly with Professor Floyd's statements and also Madam DA Boston's statements. Basically, it's present, it's here. But how do we combat it? And we combat it with both or all people who are involved in the process, such as DAs, such as judges, and such as defense attorneys, to get involved in the process and have conversations on platforms like this. Now, I've had experiences where definitely my clients have in fact been impacted just because of the color of their skin. And in those particular situations, we can fight within the system by using our right to do appeals. We can do that. But the main point is to go outside of the curfew of the actual courthouse and fight it in the community as well. Let's educate our citizens in our communities about the system and how it actually operates. And also let's be advocates when it comes to legislation that is passed. A lot of people think that being an advocate, whether it's a defense attorney or working in any position within the criminal justice system, is just fighting in the courtroom. But it's a lifestyle. You have to go beyond the four walls of the courtroom and go into the community to educate the people within your community so they can be aware of what happens in the judicial system. And not only that, you also have to go to your legislators who you elect every year. And if you see these disparities in your judicial system or in your courtroom or in your circuit, make your voice known, make your voice heard in reference to this so that changes can in fact happen. Propose new legislation. And I think that's what we need to start looking at, is being advocates on all ends, not just in the courtroom, but be well-rounded and go in our communities, and not only go in our communities, but also go to the legislators who we elect every year.
I feel like I should clap after that. Like that was an award-winning, like, like get up and get out in the community. I think the community is a major aspect of this reform. And I definitely think we definitely need more advocates and more education for our communities, particularly those of color that are disproportionately impacted by these sentencing. And so I love that. I love that, being an advocate. I want to now move on to question number 3, and it states, and this is for everyone, and what I'll do, since Ms. Hargrove so passionately ended, I'll start with her, okay? Question number 3, beginning in the summer of 2020, there was a lot of rhetoric regarding defunding the police. What is your take on this movement? Do you think it can be effective? And what are some alternatives to reduce prejudicial hyper-policing?
I love this question, because before we can actually respond to this question, we have to define defunding the police.
Yes.
Because a lot of people don't have an understanding on the actual definition. Some people propose, you have a group that proposed defunding police is basically take police out of the communities, period. Then you have another group that has a perspective of let's reroute the resources within the police department. Those are two totally different things. And we have to educate our community on terminology in reference to what do you mean by defunding the police. Can I be very transparent with you? I practiced as a public defender. I was a juvenile defense attorney, the juvenile defender in the Dougherty County Circuit in Albany, Georgia. We have an extremely high crime rate. So as part of a community activist group, I'm involved in a lot of community engagement, nonprofit organizations. We went into the community and we asked the people what they wanted. We went to the hood, we went to the projects, we went everywhere. Most of the people, we actually created data regarding this, did not want the police to leave their neighborhoods. They actually wanted more police in their neighborhoods because of the crime, the Black on Black crime. So I believe, and I wholeheartedly feel that it depends on each community. Every community should not be treated the same. And that's what we discovered when we went into the community and actually started talking to people about the defund the police movement, because every community is not the same. And so within the community I was in, they wanted the police there. However, they wanted more resources to create and build relationship and ties with the police, rather than the police just showing up when a crime has been committed. That's different. That's the part of defunding the police that reroute resources. And so I've been working on certain type of projects in the Dougherty County area, the South Georgia area, where we say, hey, let's talk to the police chief. Let's sit down and have a conversation with them and say, hey, instead of you guys spending $1.5 million on bulletproof vests, let's do some community engagement projects with the kids in impoverished areas. Let's reroute those funds so that we can build community ties between both the people in the community and the police. And so with that, I would like to say, I do believe in rerouting the funds in order to create a better relationship and ties between the community and the police. But I don't believe that it's just one blanket state defund, take the police out and leave some of these communities defenseless. I'm from Milledgeville, Georgia, and some pockets of Milledgeville, Georgia, that's Baldwin County. I think it's a little speck on the map. There is a lot of crime. I grew up in certain places that had a lot of crime. So it would be somewhat insensitive for me to say, I want my mother and my father to live in a community where there is no police, but crime still exists. So we have to find a balance in reference to what we advocate for and have a true understanding that it's not one shoe fits all for the entire areas throughout the United States.
Thank you so much. And I'm from Putnam County, or Edenton, Georgia, so I know exactly where Milledgeville is. So I love that still community-centered approach and asking the community what they need and what they prefer. I do like that. So now I'm going to ask DA Boston, what is your take on that same question? And I can reread it if necessary.
No, I mean, I think Ms. Hargrove hit it out of the park. I mean, I think, first of all, you know, the words defunding the police have been mischaracterized tremendously with this idea that police are taking up all the resources. The idea is that we're all lacking resources. And what we need to do is invest more strongly in community-based resources. But it doesn't mean we want to take away the police services. What it means is that there's a lot of things we're asking police to do and engage in that simply should not be a law enforcement function. And when we have individuals that are homeless or experiencing substance disorder abuse issues or mental health issues, you know, as a community, we've gotten to the point where we just pick up the phone and call 911 and send the police. The reality of it is that all communities need to be funded in a way that we have community-based resources to call. So unless someone is presenting a clear and present danger, and sometimes they might be, if someone is armed, right? Then that would be a situation that perhaps law enforcement needs to be there. But along the same lines, with law enforcement, we should have the alignment of those community-based advocates and trained professionals that understand and know how to de-escalate in those situations. So I don't advocate for less money for law enforcement. I advocate for more money for community services and wraparound services. And I advocate for the collaboration of those groups working hand in hand with law enforcement. So some calls are law enforcement, some calls go to our community-based organizations, and then some, it's collaboratively, we show up on scene to support one another and to help someone de-escalate in an effort to not only serve and protect the community, but serve and protect victims, serve and protect law enforcement, and most importantly, reinstill, or sometimes instill for the first time, trust in those communities, especially our Black and Brown communities that certainly don't trust calling the police for help for fear that that help will turn into death.
Thank you so much. That response was excellent. I know for me, I was taking highlights, you know, with the wraparound services, the collaboration, I think, and the reinstilling that trust. I think those are key takeaways from what you said and trying to find a balance, if not more money being put into those community agencies and those community service. And I think that, again, like you mentioned, will address some of the underlying or foundational issues that we have in our communities. Thank you so very much for that response. I would now like to give it to Attorney Floyd. So what would you suggest should be your opinion on those services or policing or defunding the police in our communities?
There's very little I could add to the two wonderful statements you just heard on that particular question. I would just make clear, though, that one reason we have such a terrible mass incarceration problem is we put in jail and prison so many people whose primary problem is they have serious mental health issues or they're a drug addict. And dealing with those problems on the front end it's going to require resources, as they said. I mean, we have other reasons we have mass incarceration. I think we'll get to that, but the Los Angeles County Jail is the largest mental hospital in the United States. The jails in every county, including Bibb County, are full of people that have serious mental health issues or they're just because they're drug addicts. And, dealing with that, rather than have police arrest them, have resources into drug rehab and counseling and social workers and mental health counselors, or having them work collaboratively with police, as people have already said, would go a long way toward helping many of these issues we're talking about.
Okay. Thank you so very much. I do like what you added again with those counselors, substance abuse programs, rehab programs, having some of those additional social workers on hand. I think that goes along with like what everyone just said, with that collaborative approach, that community-centered approach. So now what I do, I think you mentioned again right now, and I'll start with you again, Attorney Floyd. You mentioned this mass incarceration. So this leads us to our next question. So Brian Stevenson, renowned attorney and author of the novel Just Mercy, recently a movie, highlights many of the injustices that he witnessed as a criminal defense attorney and places emphasis on the effects of mass incarceration in the Black community. What is your take on mass incarceration, and why does America lead the world in the world prison population? I know you mentioned about the jails being some of the largest mental health hospitals because we're not really addressing some of the foundational issues in our community. We're just arresting them. So could you elaborate a little bit more at this point?
Yeah, thank you. And that mental health drug problems are a part of it, but there's actually much more to it. And let's make sure we understand the scope of the problem when we talk about mass incarceration. The United States does incarcerate, put in prison and jail, a much higher percentage of its population than any nation on the face of the earth. In raw numbers, we have more people behind bars than any other country in the world, any other country in the history of the world. Prisons are a fairly modern phenomenon, and it's a problem throughout the United States, but it is a particular problem in the region where we are now. The 10 states that have the highest rates of incarceration are all southern states, all states that were part of the old Confederacy, all former slaveholding states. That, of course, is no accident. Incarceration started shortly after Reconstruction came to an end with convict labor, when slavery wasn't available for free labor, they turned to the prison system. So there are historical roots for that. But it's also a fairly recent phenomenon because the prison population in Georgia and the United States has much more than doubled just since I've been a lawyer. Now, the population of the United States hasn't come anywhere near that kind of growth. It was a deliberate policy in the 80s and the 90s to start putting many more people in prison for much longer periods of time. And those policies were driven by some legitimate fear of crime, but also a lot of racism, some of it just naked, open racist appeals. And that's an unfortunate fact. We are finally starting to recognize that truth as a society, and overall prison populations have started to go down ever so slightly in the last few years. But the number of people that are in prison is just enormous compared to the rest of the world, compared to history. Why is that? There are all kinds of reasons we could go into. Some people turn to crime because we don't have the kind of social services we need. We don't have education. There aren't good jobs. But other people end up in prison because they're not really criminals at all, but they get caught up into the criminal justice system. And again, a hugely disproportionate number of those people are people of color, in particular African Americans. But I'd actually be really interested to hear what our other two panelists say on this, because this is in some ways the fundamental question tonight.
Thank you so very much from that historical perspective. So now I'm going to allow Attorney Hargrove to address the question as well about mass incarceration and why does America lead the world in the prison population?
So that I can truly paint a picture for you so you can see what Professor Floyd so eloquently stated in reference to the mass incarceration rate, or the rate of people that we incarcerate here in the United States. Imagine, starting in 1980s, you know, we had the huge war on drugs, okay? Do anyone remember the commercial where they cracked the egg? This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Okay, I'm telling my age now. But that was when the start of the huge war on drugs took place. And at that particular time, they were estimating only about 40,900 people were incarcerated around that time, okay? Fast forward to 2017, where they estimated the numbers of incarceration to be at 452,964. That's in 2017. So you're talking about from 40,000 people to over 400,000 people, if that can paint a picture for you in reference to what has mass incarceration done to this society. So with that being said, there are in fact a lot of factors that have led to it, but the majority of the factors that the policies and the laws that were created were not created by coincidence, but it was created on purpose in order to incarcerate a certain type or a particular person. And once you get entangled in that system, and that's why I advocated so wholeheartedly with my juveniles. I used to call my juveniles my kids. But as a juvenile defender, I advocated so hard because I saw it as an opportunity to put them on the right road and the right track before they got into or got entangled into the actual criminal justice system. Because I always explained to them, I always presented to them the information in reference to what happens once you get entangled. Once you get entangled, it can be a small misdemeanor, but then if you mess up doing 12 months on probation, guess what? Revocation of your probation. You're coming back, you're coming back, you're coming back. I always described it as the invisible handcuffs that Cornel West used to talk about in his book sometimes. The invisible, something that just keeps yanking you back and you can't go forward. You can't progress in your life, okay? Something that's always over your head. So with that being said, Professor Floyd mentioned several factors that causes this mass incarceration, but it's not only just the laws that are passed, it's also the fact that once someone finishes their sentence and they're labeled a felon, where are they going to live? Where are they going to work? Let's think about that. If I can't work, I can't make money. So that puts me in an ongoing cycle to, number one, go back in the streets and get money the best way I know how. Because at the end of the day, I got children at home. I have bills to pay. How am I supposed to be a productive member of society if I'm not given the opportunity, the tools and resources to do so? So those are things that we have to address. A lot of time we tend to put the Band-Aid on a situation. In order to solve this problem of systemic racism or mass incarceration, we have to dig up the roots. Or we're going to be here in another 20 years talking about the same thing. So we have to do the hard work, and we have to have the hard conversations about these issues and address the root issues so that we can find a solution.
Thank you. Going to the root, going to the source of the problem, those invisible handcuffs. I do enjoy that. You explaining it that way, giving us that vivid picture of that, talking about that ongoing cycle and not being able to escape it, even becoming part of that institutionalized mindset. So now what I'd like to do is go into our last question. I think we are at our time, about 6:47. And I'll start with DA Boston. In your experience over the last 4 years, has there been a visible shift in the criminal justice system or the progress of the criminal justice reform? Have we been set back?
I'd like to think that we have moved forward. I mean, just when I talk about what's happened here in Georgia with the election of a record-breaking number of African-American chief prosecutors, we are moving in the right direction. And so I think for the first time, the fact that we're having these open conversations about race in the criminal justice system means that we are moving forward. Do we have a long way to go? Absolutely. But I mean, what I'm reminded of is that, the professor started off with saying we go back to 1619. We have hundreds of years of work to undo. But I do think we're moving forward because when I see progressive prosecutors across the country being elected in cities on platforms of reinventing, reimagining, and addressing the inequities in the system, because that is happening in wide swaths of our country, I am hopeful. And I feel as if we have hit a moment in time where people are ready to have the conversation. And for those that aren't ready to hear it, the folks that are ready to say it are screaming louder and louder. So I feel good about where we are, although we have a long road ahead of us, and we certainly don't have anything yet to celebrate.
Thank you so very much. I now would like to turn it over to Professor Floyd.
Yeah, as I said at the outset, I've got a pretty long history dealing with these issues as a professional. And if you had asked me 35 years ago, would we be struggling with issues of racism in the criminal justice system? I said, well, yes, even then I was aware of the deep-seated, long, deep historical roots of the problems. But I think I would have thought that we would have made more progress by now. It can be discouraging over time. But there are a couple of encouraging signs, and one of them is one I said before, and it's what District Attorney Boston was just referring to. Turnover in so many prosecutors' offices of people that recognize the problem and are willing to work on it. It's still not most prosecutors' offices, not in this state and around the country, but it's a huge difference over just a few years ago. And although it hasn't made an enormous difference in this state, there's another thing that's happened over the last decade. The criminal justice reform measures that have happened through our legislature, even with a Republican governor, especially Governor Deal, things like accountability courts, to the extent we have more resources devoted to mental health courts and drug courts and other ways to divert people away from the criminal justice system to deal with the underlying problem. Now, again, that barely touches the surface of the overall criminal caseload. But I don't want to minimize it because Bibb County was one of the very first drug courts, one of the very first mental health courts in the state, and it's made a world of difference for a lot of people over time. So that's another positive thing that's happening. And the truth is, I don't know what it was about the murder of George Floyd that caught people's attention more than so many of the other cases and the names we could just go on all night saying for a long time, but just over the last 7 or 8 years, it got people's attention more. And the very idea that there is policing going on that is very harmful to certain communities, a lot of people are talking about it that weren't talking about it a year ago. A lot of people put up Black Lives Matter signs and it's nothing more than lip service. But I can tell you that and in communities of white folk that I talk to, there are people that are recognizing the issue. They're wanting to have discussion groups in their churches when it would not have been talked about before. I love the way that Ms. Boston put it. We got so far to go, but I think there are signs that people are recognizing the problem. And as several people have already said tonight, until you first address the truth of what's been going on, you can't possibly do anything to try to fix the problem. And I think there are some signs that we're turning that corner, but it's these kind of gains can be so fragile. It takes just constant work. You just got to keep at it, going on and on. But looking at the faces and the names that I see out there, that gives me as much hope as anything, because I see so many of our current students that I've gotten to know pretty well. I see a good many of our graduates over the last 5, 10, 15 years that have signed on here, that are doing great work out there. And that gives me as much hope as anything.
Thank you so very much. I want to now give our final words to Attorney Hargrove.
In reference to very quickly touching on the question, where's the criminal system today? And whether or not I feel like we have made any progress. During a time that I have been honored to represent clients and now represent the state, I'm inspired by so many other trailblazers that have paved the way, such as Madam DA Boston. I've been hearing about all the wonderful work that she's been doing for years, and people tend to ask me, you've been defending people all of these years. What made you just jump and just become a DA, an assistant DA? And my response has always been, we have to be the change within the system that we hope to see. Meaning we have to work within the system. It can be done. And it's going to take parties on both sides in order to solve these issues and do the dirty work and pull up the root issues so that we can make some progress and so that we can make changes. And so whether I'm on the defense side or the state side, we all can work together in a collaborative effort and have synergy in order to make these improvements within our criminal system, because it will take all of us. It's going to be a long road. We have a lot of work to do, but I am inspired by those who have already paved the way, who are paving the way. And those are my thoughts on it. Nothing that's worth having will ever be easy, nothing. But I like to share a quote because sometimes I can get long-winded and I don't want to take up a lot of time, but this is a very powerful quote from a French poet and novelist in which he said, "Nothing else in the world, not even all the armies, is so powerful as an idea whose time has come." That's Victor Hugo, and it's from his book, The Future of a Man. That's saying, when our time has come for our ideologies, for our ideas, for our dream of how we want or how we envision this criminal justice system to be, when the time has come, nothing can stop it. However, until that time has come, we have to continue working towards progress and working together. And I leave with that.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. We really appreciate all of the insight and experience that you all had to offer. I know that especially DA Boston has another event to get to. So if you all would like to log off, please feel free. The next panel, which is more focused on discussing criminal justice reform, will start promptly at 7. So if anyone wants to take these next few minutes to gather themselves and the panelists for this panel, thank you. And if you would like to log off, feel free to do so, or you can stay and listen to the next panel. But again, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate you. And the next panel will begin promptly at 7. Good evening, everyone. So it is 7 o'clock. We will go ahead and begin our next panel. I will introduce. So we have attorney Sarah Flack. She's a solo practitioner and she specializes in criminal defense and civil rights cases. We also have attorney Terrell Bynum. He is a Mercer alum and he served as a public defender for 3 years in Los Angeles. And last but certainly not least, we have Kim Easterling, attorney Kim Easterling. She's an assistant United States attorney for the Department of Justice.
Good evening, everyone. And for those of you who are just joining us tonight, I am Dr. Ansel Booker. I am the Director for Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives. And I want to start off by giving this disclaimer that my background is in STEM and higher education. So law is something that is very new to me. So please bear with me while I go through these wealth of questions to gain your experience and your knowledge to share with us so that we all may learn and grow together, specifically myself. So what I'll do is I'll start tonight with our panelists, okay? So I'm going to start with DA Bynum. So could you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you work, and your experience in criminal justice and the criminal justice system?
Okay, so yeah, for everyone who doesn't know, my name is Terrell Bynum, and I graduated from Mercer Law after attending Morehouse College. I worked in California for quite some time, and I served as a public defender in Los Angeles County. And the way that county works is there's a number of courthouses in different communities. And so while I was there, I had the opportunity to work in a number of different courthouses from Long Beach to Inglewood to downtown LA. And so I worked there for a little over 3 years, and then I made a transition into civil work. I had a small stint in family law where you can see a lot of parallels and overlaps between the law. And now I currently work for Kemper Insurance in insurance defense, where I actually defend individuals once they become accused or sued in the law for a car accident.
Thank you so very much. I'll now go to Attorney Easterling.
Hello, everyone. As they said, my name is Kimberly Easterling. I'm currently an AUSA here in Macon. That is a fancy term for a federal prosecutor. I have been with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Macon for about 6.5 years, assigned to the criminal division. I handle all kinds of cases, white collar sex crimes, but primarily I deal in violent crime, drugs, and firearms. And prior to becoming a federal prosecutor, I was a state prosecutor in Augusta for about 6 years. So I'm just happy to be here and have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And now Attorney Black.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Terrell. Good to see you. I am Sarah Flack. I'm a criminal defense attorney here in Atlanta. I started my career as a prosecutor in the Fulton County DA's office, and I graduated Mercer Law in 2014. And I started my criminal practice in criminal defense and civil rights in 2017. And I am so excited to be here with all of you today.
Thank you so very much. I love your background. Those are beautiful portraits.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think we did an HBCU shout out earlier, so I have to give it to DA Bynum for Morehouse. I think you mentioned that earlier. Okay, so we'll
just clarify that I was not a DA. I was a public defender.
Oh, public defender. Okay.
Yes.
Correction on my notes. Yes.
But no problem. Thank you for the shout out.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and get right into our questions. So the first question for tonight: what does criminal justice reform look like to you, and where do we start? And what I'll do is I start with AUSA Easterling.
Just gonna keep this off of mute. And I also would add, I'm a Mercer Law alum as well. So
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Go Bears.
Yes, that's right. So when I think about reform, I think about it being contained in about 3 components, right? So you have your, what I would call your foot soldiers. These are your law enforcement personnel, your community activists, and then you have your gatekeepers, which are your prosecutors, your defense attorney, and your judges. And then you would have legislators, who are those who have been elected by persons who are in the community. And so when we talk about reform, I think there has to be a continuum. And so all 3 parts have to be functioning and communicating together, and they have to have an end result, which is going to be what is just, what is fair, and how can we have restoration of trust in our system. It looks like a fair application of the law, something that is reasonable, taking into account someone's background when evaluating the crime, and more importantly, that the community not only has trust in the system, but they have trust that the system is going to work in their favor, regardless of whether they are a victim, witness, or a suspect that is accused of a crime. And so essentially with those 3 parts, that is how we start having the conversation about reforming the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And I love the fact that you talked about this being on a continuum with all 3 parts working together. So I'm now going to turn it over to Attorney Bynum.
Okay, yes, I think that was Attorney Easterling, that was well stated. Something that, I would say to start out with is going to be focusing on building the trust in the community, almost in a sense of from a PR, but really it's about trust. You can't police a community or at least you cannot police a community effectively if they don't trust you. And that's going to start with accountability. We're going to need to see some accountability before that trust can be, mended. And so until that happens, I don't see any room for growth. However, there's another side of it as well, which I would say is sentencing reform. Too many people are going to jail right now, and they're going to jail for too long. And so the issue is once they go into jail, when they come out, there's a lot of focus being on the penalization side, but not really on the, reforming the individual and trying to put them in a better circumstance so they do not end up back in jail. And so I think those are 2 areas that have a lot of room for growth and improvement.
Thank you so very much. And now what I want to do is ask the same question to Attorney Black.
So I agree with everything that both AUSA Easterling and Attorney Bynum have said wholeheartedly. The one thing that I would like to add, and this is like near and dear to my heart, is, and you don't hear this a lot in the news because it's just not, I mean, quite frankly, it's not sexy. But I also think we need to pay more attention to how we're incarcerating folks. Even the people that we think did the terrible thing and are the worst of the worst. We need to start looking inside the four walls of our prisons and jails, and jails specifically. I mean, if you're in a jail, you are presumed innocent. You haven't, been even convicted of a crime. And I can't tell you how many clients I have that are in the jails right now here in Fulton County and DeKalb and Clayton that aren't getting fed a breakfast, or that are in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, that literally have nothing to do. And even if you believe we should be tough on crime and tough on those who have harmed others, I think we also have to get to this point of, look, these are still human beings. And so if we have literally a captive audience, what are we doing with people that are incarcerated? How are we filling their day? Are they outside? Or do they have a schedule? Are they eating right? Are they exercising? Are we instilling the things that we think people should be doing? Are we educating people? Because even if you don't think that person deserves it, what about the guard who has to protect themselves in jail all day, every day, and then go home to their family, and deal with, if you look at the rates of suicide and of harming themselves in careers, probation officers and also correctional officers have some of the highest rates of suicide and self-harm. And so I think we also have to start looking internally inside our jails and prisons when we talk about criminal justice reform, so that when people do get out, we are building better neighbors and we are making people better than they were when they first entered our system. And I don't think we talk about that enough. So I think that's really, really important as well.
Thank you so very much for sharing that part of the reform aspect needing to be the highest in terms of priority and what we do and how we look at it. I know recently in the news, I saw that many of the incarcerated individuals were sharing their food and their meals that they were receiving, and how many of those times it was basically not edible. The food was not, because of they were receiving such low care, whether it's mental health care or even physical exercise as well. So thank you for sharing that and placing a greater spotlight on that as well. I do want to move to question number 2 really, really quickly here. It says, what role do prosecutors play in the reformation of the criminal justice system? And I'll start with Attorney Bynum.
I stuck around for the first panel, and Professor Floyd spoke on this, and I think he was spot on. It's so important. I mean, literally, prosecutors control enforcement of the law, and they can either give the law teeth or they can take it away. And I think that prosecutor, from either on a case-by-case basis or on a policy basis, can change so much, because they can decide, okay, you know what, this case right here, this individual, they need a break, or they need this program could help this person. And when you have prosecutors, when they approach the law and with an attitude of wanting to help, or seeing people as people, that can change a lot, and not being so tied to the laws, and especially the more dated laws that may be more deeply rooted in racism and bias, and people who can check their own bias. So yeah, I mean, prosecutors are the key holders for the law. All that a defense attorney can do is challenge the law, and that's strong, but it's nowhere near the power that a prosecutor has.
Thank you for sharing that information about that power dynamic and that shift, and how we have to put the responsibility back on the prosecutor, and reiterating that from our first forum. And now I'll go to AUSA Easterling. What role do you believe prosecutors play in the reformation of the criminal justice, of the reform of the criminal justice system?
Well, I think I said we were gatekeepers earlier. We are the administrators of justice. We stand as a buffer between the community and literally changing someone's life. I will add this, as a prosecutor, to sentence someone to life in prison, which I have done before, to sentence someone to 20, 10, 5, that is a heavy burden. And I think that it's important for prosecutors to take their jobs very seriously, and to understand that what we do literally has the ability to shift the narrative. and put trust and restore trust back into the system. Now, one thing I will, and I apologize, everything that Attorney Bynum said was a great point, and I agree with. But I always try to remind people that our first job as prosecutors is the public safety. So we deal with the what before we deal with the why. And I will follow up with that. For me, you know, being a prosecutor, I can't just deal with the what, which is, has there been a crime committed? What is it? What can we charge and why? I have to also deal with the why. And I think that most prosecutors who really are seeking to make a difference, to advocate for victims, to protect the community, are going to deal with the what first, but then they're going to go to the why. Why did this person commit this crime? Was it a crime of opportunity? Are they desperate? Are there mental health issues? What can we do as prosecutors to address those concerns? And so it has to be a holistic view, but initially you've got to have people in positions such as mine who are going to see a 3D view of the community and really want to seek and do justice, because a lot of people don't know this, but when you become a prosecutor, you get sworn in as an attorney. But when you become a prosecutor, you take a second oath to seek and do justice. So it's even a higher burden versus a private attorney would have. And so I just see our roles as prosecutor as being administrators of justice. Now, it's not something that we're always going to get right. You know, there are some cases that I do regret, admittedly, but overall, I think that if we're looking at the community in a 3D view and trying to look at the what, then the why, I think that prosecutors play a very pivotal role. As a matter of fact, I think the most important role in criminal justice reform. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, because that provides a lot of clarification to someone like myself, especially when you gave this, the example of the 3D view, and that you have to be the administrators of justice and you actually have to take a second oath to look at the what and then the why. Thank you so very much for explaining that to us all. Now I'm going to allow Attorney Flack to give her response.
So I would say, you know, the question is, I guess, what can prosecutors do, or what role do they have? And I guess I would yeah. challenge, you know, let me say this again, I used to be a prosecutor. I would say one of the biggest things I think prosecutors can do is, you know, you can't start looking at a case with, well, this is the law, this is my evidence, and I can prove this. I guess so my answer to that would be, well, just because you can doesn't mean you should, because we all know that, you know, the criminal justice system and our laws were not designed to protect a certain segment of us population, mainly Black men and Black people. And so I can't tell you how many cases I have where, yeah, if you look at the law, yeah, you could prove it. Yeah, the evidence is terrible. But for a lack of a better phrase, we here now, you know, so what are we going to do? The person did it. The facts are not good. But is this somebody that we want to throw away? Is their life not worth saving? Or even if we decide, hey, we're going to send this 17-year-old kid down the road for an armed robbery for 10 years, because that's what the law says is the mandatory minimum. Well, who is the kid going to be in 10 years? He's going to be a 27-year-old kid who had to fend for his life. It's starving every day and not seeing sun, not feeling the sunshine on his back for 10 years in our prison system, having been forced to join a gang to survive. Is that somebody that we want to be out at the grocery store in 10 years when they're 27 next to you or your kids or your grandma? I know for me, I don't want that kid to be behind me after having served, you know, lived that life, what they've had to live for 10 years. So I think, I guess the long answer here is, I think as prosecutors, we have to start getting away from hiding behind the law and the facts, which is coincidentally what we're trained to do as lawyers, and start looking at, okay, well, yeah, the law and the facts are on my side as a prosecutor. They usually are. But looking beyond, who I want this person to be, how can I make sure that this doesn't happen again so that the community is safe? What can I do? What services, what other alternative sentences, what other alternative programming, what can I do to make sure that this young person or this person is better when they get out, that they are a better person? So I think that would be my answer to that.
Thank you so very much. But I do want to, I want to stay with you the next question, if you don't mind. What can we do to increase the values of deterrence and rehabilitation?
Oh, that's a deep one, right? A loaded question.
That's a loaded one.
Well, I think it starts with us. I think that we as lawyers have to again sort of get outside the indictment and the facts and the law, and understand people's stories. I mean, at the core of our job in the criminal justice system, whether you're a prosecutor, a defense lawyer, a judge, or a police officer, is how did this person get here? If I'm a victim, how did this person, come to my house on this day and rob me or steal my car? Like, how do we stop this from happening? And we know there are certain things that tend to rear their head pretty regularly. And it usually relates around not having had a support system at home, not having the resources, drug use and addiction, lack of education, lack of opportunity, or just literally being hungry and needing to be out here trying to feed themselves or their child or their family. And so we have to really get at the core, and that's all soft, mushy stuff that we don't like to talk about. But we have to solve those problems first, which really relate around community and being there for each other. If we're talking about deterrence, that's where the conversation starts. By the time you're a case file or you're an indictment number or you're a defendant, however you want to call it, we're already too late. So the criminal justice system is sort of the end game if we're talking about deterrence. So we've got to start looking, we got to figure out people's story and figure out what the common threads are to figure out how to stop that. And once you're here, what can you do as a prosecutor or a defense lawyer? What wraparound services, what holistic things can we do to give people the things that they were looking for, prior to committing crime?
You have some great taglines. I'm going to take this one. Get at the core, right? We are here now. What are we going to do?
We're here now. That's my
We're here now.
life
what are we going
motto.
to do?
We're here now. So now what?
We're here now. So now what? But I want to turn it back over to AUSA Easterling to add your perspective to what can we do for deterrence and rehabilitation.
So I've been a prosecutor for 12 and a half years, and what I can say is that we are not going to prosecute our way out of crime. We are not going to prosecute our way into a safer, more educated community. It's just not going to happen like that. And so when we talk about deterrence and rehabilitation, what I think it requires is a buy-in. I mean, you've got to have a commitment from all people. And I do think that law enforcement and judges and prosecutors do need to lead the fight in that, to say we're committed to restoring the community and also to building up people. I think that there needs to be awareness and education of the benefits of rehabilitation and deterrence, as well as funding. That's something that people don't talk about. I mean, we always talk about reform, but we need the dollars, right? We're gonna have to put our money where our mouth is. That means that somebody's taxes are gonna be raised. And so when people put money behind their mouth, that's when you know it gets serious, because there are programs, there are grants, there are resources that we can give to people returning from prison or jail and to youth so that we can prevent the youth from getting involved in the criminal justice system. And we need to employ people with these services. So when you talk about deterrence, educational programs, mental health treatment, job skills training, mentorship, housing assistance. I mean, I interviewed a guy a couple of years ago as part of a program in our office. This man had been in prison for 20 years, and we were doing mock interviews. And you think about how much society has changed, technology has changed. What can we equip him for after he is released? And so that goes back into my funding piece. And then rehabilitation, it still goes back to mentoring, mental health treatment, educational, vocational training, housing. What can we do to really show that we are committed, not just to people once they get out, but what can we do to prevent them from ever going into the system? And so I think that that requires financial backing.
I mean, those were some great nuggets here. I just was going to reiterate some stuff here. We will not prosecute our way out of this. We have to go to funding. And I think this goes back to what Attorney Flack said, getting at the core, which is the education, the mental health, the housing assistance, the mentorship, the vocational and educational training. So thank you for that as we look at the core and the root system of some of these issues that we're dealing with. And now I want to allow Attorney Bynum to add his perspective.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I mean, these are two great answers by the two before me. And Sarah, you have all the taglines and everything. But the idea that you cannot prosecute your way out of this is so key. And it comes down to funding, right? So, you know, the first thing is with funding, and I believe Attorney Hargrove mentioned this before, in the idea of defunding the police with not so much, you know, terminating the police or removing them, but reallocating those resources. If we could reallocate those resources where, you know, at this point, there is an issue with, you know, creating police states in certain communities, if we could take that focus and redirect it to actually, you know, rehabilitation, to changing the experience when you are in jail, to stop focusing on penalization and focus on education when they're in jail so they can be better prepared when they leave. And also, you know, a big thing is going to be the whole construct of jail as far as the prisons for profit, you know, the cheap labor that's created in jail. You know, there's no, it's just not, right now, it's not economically advantageous to change jail the way it is or the way that our economy is structured. I mean, there's so much cheap labor that comes from jail. I mean, you know, so we have to really change our priorities as a country in order to, you know, actually have some change in our laws and policies, because it doesn't just start with jail. We get to do more focus on, and I've said this earlier, but probation and parole. If we think about if probation and parole was actually just focused on trying to get someone in a better position than what they were when they came in, instead of just penalizing them and putting them back in jail whenever they have any type of violation. So, you know, and just for instance, and I know about in, you know, LA County, I can't speak for other areas, but if you even have, if you're accused of a parole violation, you know, for a felony, any parole violation, you're going in jail for 2 weeks before you see a judge. So as guilty of it, you're not guilty, it doesn't matter. You're in jail for 2 weeks. If you had a job, you lost it. Anything you had is gone. And then you could go, before the judge and say, oh, you're not found guilty, but you've still been in jail for 2 weeks. And that just doesn't make sense, which is, to be honest, a lot of things when it comes to how we incarcerate and how we police people. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is going to be defunding and just reallocating those resources, because we have way too many prisons and they really generate too much profit. So
I think you brought out a great point here, Attorney Bynum, saying that it was not economically advantageous at this point. And that's why people haven't looked to revise or either reallocate funds, because again, it's economically stimulating someone's pockets, right? You know, you talked a little bit about like how it's cheap labor. And then again, with the privatization of prisons. So I thank you for sharing that aspect of the system as well. So thank you so very much. And now what I want to do is move on to the next question here, which is question number 4. Have you seen the idea of providing people with occupational licensing firsthand? Do you think it can be effective? And this is going to go to AUSA Easterling.
So I have not seen it firsthand, but I do think that it would be effective. I do think occupational requirements do need to be eased depending on the occupation. Like, you know, lawyers need to go to law school, you know, doctors need to go to medical school and have training. But with other occupations, I do think that if we eased up on the restrictions, then it would be easier for people to, you know, be able to, you know, create their own jobs. They can have their own business, apply to jobs, which, you know, leads to economic stability and it leads to self-pride. And I do think, you know, it really can help decrease the amount of crimes that we're having in the community. So, I mean, overall, I do think it would be effective. I'm not sure how that would be implemented. But I do think it would be effective. Thank you.
I love this part that you talk about, this economic stability, which I think is one of the root issues that we're dealing with. You know, a lot of people not having that economic stability in their communities. And so therefore they may turn to some of these alternatives that may lead to them being incarcerated. So thank you so very much. I want to ask Attorney Flack to add her perspective as well on the occupational leasing or licensing, excuse me, not leasing.
So I guess I don't know I mean, I will say this. I think that certain professions or certain things there needs to be some higher level or standard of I guess regulation and training to be able to do them. But I think if in context with the criminal justice system, and reform. I think if we're talking about occupational licensing, we're already missing like 90-something% probably, if I had to guess, of the issue. If the issue isn't the people who are trying to get a license, I mean, most of the people that we incarcerate or that are, you know, convicted of things are not those that are trying to, or that have the ability, let me say that, have the ability to pursue the careers that they would probably want, because our system says if you are a felon, you cannot be a lawyer, or if you are a felon or you've got a, you know, suspended license, you can't drive a commercial truck, and so therefore the licensing, or, you know, you can't even get it. So I guess my point here is that it's already a losing battle. Like that's not the issue. The issue is making things more accessible for most people and people of color, so that opportunity is available, so that they can have the opportunity to then decide if they want to get a license, or, you know, with this occupational licensing thing. But I think it's already sort of a lost cause if that's where the conversation starts. And I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but you know, again, it's opportunity, and it's even being able to do it in the first place. And I think we preclude a lot of people from doing that in our system.
Yes, it does make a lot of sense. And so I'll let Attorney Bynum add his perspective.
Yeah, I kind of share those sentiments. I mean, I do want to, you know, I think we have to focus on reforming, you know, the jail experience. But when it comes to being able to obtain licenses, then, you know, to me, that sounds like someone who needs to be on a work release, who needs to be out of jail in the first place. You know, I think the bigger focus is trying to get people out of jail versus, you know, helping them get a license when they're in. I mean, I see a lot of room for abuse and for other financial gains that could pretty much set up people to fail. I mean, maybe if there's some type of apprenticeship, you know, something along those lines, that could allow someone to actually have their own job, you know, create their own source of income when they get out. Because, you know, I think the bigger issue is once you have that stain on your record, you can't get employed after. It doesn't matter what license you have. So, you know, I think it'd be more beneficial to limit what employers can see on someone's record when they apply for a job than it would be to do occupational licensing while incarcerated. But I do not have much experience with that. So
thank you for sharing your perspective. I want to stay with you for the next question. So the next question states, what does reformation look like, or reform look like short term?
You know, there is no quick fix to reform. You know, so short term, I guess I'll rephrase it in first steps. We have to change sentencing and just the idea of getting people in jail. I think we need to focus on less incarceration. You know, like that, there's really no moving forward without that. And once again, it's accountability. You know, until we can start holding officers accountable, we're not going to see any decrease in, you know, police misconduct.
Thank you so very much. Attorney Flack?
So I am going to disagree with Terrell, who I know very well and is a friend of mine, because I think we always fall behind this sword of it's complicated, and it is complicated, but I actually don't think that it's as complicated as we make it seem. I think there are things that we can do now today that are free and like literally would be from one day to the next would make a huge difference. And if you look at countries that are doing it, like Norway, I had the opportunity to go to Norway a couple of years ago and tour Halden Prison, which is a state-of-the-art prison. And one of the things that their warden implemented right away was this issue of dynamic security. They couldn't keep spending money on more guards and more training and more bars and more, you know, segregation, and they just couldn't afford it. And so they said, I'm going to deal with what we have now. So one of the things I think we could do today is if we start this issue of dynamic security with inside our prisons, where what they do and other places here in the US, like North Dakota, have started doing this in their state prison system. They require their guards to connect with their inmates. Here, that's called fraternization. So, but what they do is, and we know is human nature, if you connect with somebody, one, the person trusts you, there's a level of trust, so you're not having to be as concerned about somebody's safety issues in a prison. They require their guards to have meals with their inmates that they supervise. They require them to sit down, especially the ones that are in segregation, sit down and talk to them. Hey man, how's it going? How you doing today? Another thing that they do is called PRs instead of DRs. So here we have DRs, which are disciplinary records. There they require, if you're going to do a DR, you also have to have a PR, which is a positive reinforcement. It's literally the way we train puppies. Who's my puppy sitting right here? We positively reinforce them. So if they do something good, we also acknowledge that. We don't do that here. So, hey, this is a guy who came into the system who fought everybody when somebody didn't do something he liked. And now instead of fighting the guy next to him, if he gets upset, he, hits a wall. That's not the ideal, but on the scale of progress, that's progress. He's not putting his hands on somebody else. Now look, you punch your concrete wall in your cell. That's progress. And then hopefully we get from there to, hey, we talk it out, or instead of, now we talk it out, we yell it or whatever. But we've got to look at things on a continuum, just like a harm reduction basis that we're seeing in some of this addiction treatment. And that's free. But it would require, so I guess the other thing I want to say that we could do is we also have to cut our officers some slack. And I am not the biggest fan of officers. I get it. What's been going on in our system is not right. But I also don't think that we afford our officers and our correctional officers and police officers a space to also feel free to share when they're scared. I can tell you right now, if my loved one was a police officer who was stopping people at 2 in the morning on 75 in Atlanta, I would be scared. They don't know what they're walking into. So we also need to allow that space, and we don't do that with officers. We create a culture of having to be tough and, hey, I can't tell you if I was scared or if I grabbed my gun because I didn't know who was in my car. We also have to allow that. They're also people. So just a little bit of grace and a little bit of connection, just a tiny bit of that, I think would be a free way to start that dynamic security, which is free. And which I think we would see less, instances of excessive use of force, because it's harder to mess up a cop or a guard in a prison that you connect with or that cares about you. Those are things we can do right now. I know that was a long answer, but I'm super passionate about this.
Yes, and I think that's great that we looked at it from alternative perspectives as well, because I definitely took notes on the disciplinary record with also the positive reinforcement. I do think human nature is for us to connect. So thank you for sharing those perspectives. So I'm gonna let AUSA Easterling share her thoughts.
I agree with Attorney Bynum in the sense that I don't think there is a catch-all for short-term reformation. I think that there are steps that can be taken because, as we all know, relationships take time, and reform is the same way. People have to believe in it. They have to be committed to it. And so conversations need to be started, steps needs to be taken. I mean, I'm always going to be a proponent of education. We cannot do anything until people understand why we're doing it and what's the end game, what are we seeking to accomplish? And then it goes back to start those steps. We need to commit more resources to various programs to help people transition and to educate them. So thank you.
Yes, education has definitely been mentioned several times tonight to address some of the issues that we are dealing with within the community. So thank you so very much. I'm going to now start with Attorney Flack. So this question states, do you have any ideas on how to move towards long-term permanent reformation or reform of the criminal justice? So we did short-term, so now let's look a little bit with long-term.
Yes, I mean, it's basically what I just said. There's just no easy way around it. We can't tell people in a system to not commit crime or not be violent when we are doing those things institutionally as prosecutors and as police officers and as defense lawyers. So we all have to take 5 steps back and go back to the thing that we used to do, or I don't even want to say we used to do because we never really have done it, but it's connection, it's caring about our neighbor, it's caring about the person that's sitting on the opposite table of us, or that's the person in the jumpsuit. I think we have to agree that there are rules, just like we agree at football or basketball, there are rules. And in the criminal justice system, okay, there are rules as well. If you're incarcerated, even if you're, accused of doing the worst thing, you still deserve to, eat a healthy breakfast and have 3 meals a day. Or, when you're released from prison, I had a guy this morning who was released from prison in April, who was on a great mental health plan for 5 years with medication and a psychiatrist, and was released in April with no medication, and literally within days went into a psychotic break. Like, we can't do these things to people. There's just a baseline of rules that we've got to understand and care about our fellow human, whether or not they're a defendant on an indictment number. And we've just gotten away from that. It's a lot of this guy in the jumpsuit, person in jail, go away for 20 years, and we don't care how we treat you while you're there. So until we get those things together, I think it's laughable to expect somebody to get out and just be this superhuman after having been basically enslaved, which is what we do in our system now. So those are the things that we all have to start doing for long-term, real, meaningful change.
Thank you so very much. AUSA Easterling, what are your thoughts on long-term reform?
It needs to be comprehensive. I have brought up, the 3 parts. You got your foot soldiers, your gatekeepers, and your legislators. And so all parts need to be involved. But what I will say about long-term reform is ultimately this is a heart issue before it is anything else. People truly have to be committed and want to change. And it has to come from the top down. It can't just be people on the line, so to speak. It has to be a commitment from people who are in supervisory positions, people who are on hiring panels. And why does that matter? Because a person on a hiring panel is able to gauge the disposition of someone who's coming into a job, for example, as a prosecutor. And let me just say this, I work with law enforcement all the time, and yeah, there always are going to be bad apples in a bunch. No, I don't think anybody who's credible would ever say there's not going to be. Most of the officers that I have worked with have been good officers. Now, have some been buttholes? Yes. And can you train? Yes, we have done training. I have done training, but to go back to my original point, it's a heart issue. Because even with training, if someone is biased, if someone has a prejudice, that is going to be displayed whenever there's interaction. And that's law enforcement with the community. That is lawyer with client, prosecutor with defendant, judge with whoever it has to be. So the first has to be a heart issue, and it has to come from the top down. I go back to, I think one of the things that Attorney Black mentioned was legislation. You have to have people in place who are pushing legislation that's really going to benefit the community long term. You have to have education targeting youth. You've got to have housing, mental health treatment, roundtable discussions with different people in the community, communication skills. A lot of times, culturally, different groups communicate with each other in different ways. And that manifests itself a lot of times in arrests when we have law enforcement who've not been trained because they're unaware of how to deal with someone who may come from perhaps a different type of background. And so it has to be comprehensive, hitting on all sides, and it all needs to start around the same time. And so I think that's how that's one of the ways. I don't have all the answers. I think that's one of the ways that we can tackle reform in the long term.
I definitely took notes again, adding that being a heart issue when that bias and prejudice does show up, and looking at the top down, especially with legislation, and then that cultural competency training about different cultures and how we communicate. I definitely took notes on those. So I think those definitely are important, and also including those roundtable discussions. I'm going to allow Attorney Bynum to share his thoughts.
I really like the term comprehensive. I think that's very true. Where my opinion starts to kind of go and be more independent is kind of the root of the issue. I don't think we're going to have make any progress in any headway unless we really, attack policing, because that's where this whole criminal justice system starts at. The first encounter with police, the arrest, everything starts with police and police interaction. And, you can change a lot of things, but if people continue to get arrested at an alarming rate, then, we're still going to have the same issues. I don't know if people follow what happened or what goes on in Los Angeles, but and it's not the only city where this has happened, but they were actually, officer gangs, officers that were running, criminal organizations, gang members, they had gang tattoos and affiliations. And when you have that, I don't really see any room for improvement without a complete restructuring. Training is one thing, and I don't want to just, badmouth law enforcement and all officers, because I've worked very closely with officers, and even in personal experiences, there are some amazing officers out there. I mean, hands down. And I don't think anyone becomes an officer to do bad, but just the entire system. And when you talk about training, a lot of the training being on the field or in the field training, you learn these horrible habits and these ways in an environment, and over time you become part of that environment. And so we have to really address that. And I think one big thing, and it ties into the idea where it's all kind of based in the heart, self-policing. And when I say self-policing, I don't mean, just have a community police itself. I mean, have the officers that police a community be members of that community. I think we need to have more of that. And I know you can't have every officer be a member of the community they police, but what if a majority was? What would it look like if officers' children went to school in the same district that they police? That it would be different. They would know the people. And so I think it really has to start with just restructuring the way the police is set up. I even say it's one thing to know the community members, which, and I'm going to use Los Angeles as an example because that's my experience. In Los Angeles, officers, they go into the community, they know the kids as they're coming up, as they're being raised, but they're not getting to know them for their benefit. They're actually keeping, it's called gang field cards. And so every time they interact with a kid, they say, oh, they're from this neighborhood, they're from this block, they know these gang members. And so they document every interaction with them. And then if they do have, some accusation, an indictment, or a complaint, at that complaint, they're attaching on a gang allegation and saying, well, because they're in this neighborhood, they live around this gang, they know these people, we're going to say that they're a gang member. And then that enhances their sentence. So I really think it's our entire approach and checking our own bias, because everyone has a bias. Everyone does. But, you have to be aware of it, and you have to, be able to not use that in your job, which is a very difficult role. I mean, with police, very dangerous situations, but we have to figure out a better way to address policing.
And thank you for sharing your thoughts with that self-policing.
Sorry, that was very long.
No, it wasn't. I think it was great. But I just want to say thank you for sharing your thoughts with that self-policing. I do like that idea as well. And so now we've come to the time about 7:45 where we're going to look at our last question for tonight. And I'm going to start with AUSA Easterling. And the question states, is there anything law students, because I know we have some law students tonight on the virtual panel here, is there anything law students can do to get involved now? If so, what, and is that work rewarding?
I think it's always going to be rewarding when you're involved in something that you believe in. I think doing symposiums like this, that's the education piece again, is a very valuable way to listen to information from different people, to gain more insight into the system. And it also refines a law student's perception on what he or she may want to do and what they may be interested in. So I would say keep doing the educational initiatives like these symposiums, volunteer with different organizations. I mean, you got to get out there and see what's out there in order to know what it is you want to do. Keep the long game in mind. When we're talking about criminal justice reform, it is not going to happen overnight. I don't subscribe to the notion, let's just burn it down. And there's nothing in the interim. And so you want to keep the long game in mind, knowing that you may not be where you want to be, or you may want the system to be a certain way tomorrow. But if we keep working, it is going to get there when we get like-minded people in different positions on the puzzle. And the other thing is, it's important to get to know different sides of the conversation. Everybody who I talk to about reform, I don't agree with. And they don't agree with me. And I think that's good because we're challenged. And from those disagreements, I think sometimes are birthed different creative ideas on how to attack issues of reformation. And so, you know, keep the long game in mind. Don't be afraid to volunteer with different organizations to get a different perspective, and talk to people who are different from you, who hold different beliefs, because they may be able to challenge you in such a way that you birth an idea, or just look at the argument in a different way. And certainly as an attorney or as future attorneys, you're going to have to know all sides of an argument. So that's what I would add about how students can get involved. Thank you.
Beautiful. Know all sides of the argument. I will definitely be taking that to my next meeting. Know all sides of the argument. So I'm going to go also now to Attorney Flack for her closing statements.
Yes, I would totally agree with everything she just said. I think, you know, especially while you're in law school, you've got such an opportunity, you know, to go knock on defense attorneys' doors, prosecutors' doors, say, hey, I just want to intern. Let me help you on a case. Learn every side of this. If you know I know when I was in law school, I really wanted to be a prosecutor. And luckily, I had an opportunity to go and have an experience doing some defense work that really opened my mind. And so I guess I would say, you know, if you know you want to do criminal work, try every side of it. Work at a DA's office, work with the public defender's office, a defense attorney, go get involved with some community policing, you know, see what it's like for police officers, go do some stuff with people that are incarcerated or victims, so that you really have a full understanding personally of what all, because these are all really complicated, you know, areas that all really come together, and they're kind of always on you as the lawyer, whether you're the defense lawyer or the prosecutor. All of these diverging interests really are in your hands, and the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to make the right decision that is the best decision, and that really furthers these issues and solves things. So I would just say, get your hands dirty and be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and just learn as much as you can, because, you know, we all need the help on this side of it. And once you get that law degree and pass the bar, and now it's time to make money and pay those loans back, and it's a lot harder to do that. So just take advantage of being a student right now, enjoy it, learn, and learn everything you can.
Thank you so much. And this closing statement from Bynum, Attorney Bynum.
Well, I think they about said it. No, yeah, you know, that's really it. You know, get involved. You know, be fearless. This is the time where you can truly, you know, just try something. And if it doesn't work, it's fine. You know, you'll learn from it. You know, go around people who have different perspectives. You know, if you, for instance, I'm going to give a plug for Professor Sarah Gerd Moore's. Oh my gosh, I can't even think of the name of it. It's been so long, I'm aging myself.
Habeas Project?
The Habeas Project.
Yes.
Yeah, I did that. I was, you know, I wanted to be a gung-ho prosecutor. I mean, hands down, I know I want to be a prosecutor. I was like, I'll do defense later in life. And I talked to her, and I got into the Habeas Project, and it was such just a mind-altering and mind-opening experience. And so you want to continue to be challenged. If you're not being challenged, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Yeah, get involved, join organizations. And when I say be fearless, just make sure, like, if you don't believe in something, if you disagree with something, don't be afraid to say that. You know, it's not about being right or wrong, but just state your opinion, challenge something, and someone may have a better thought, you know, or something that inspires you. Either way, you'll grow from it. So just never be afraid to challenge the status quo or the popular opinion.
I may go back to law school. No, just kidding. No, just kidding.
You don't want these loans.
I have friends. Listen, I have friends that are lawyers. I love it. We get to argue, and I get to play my role occasionally. So, but thank you so very much for everyone for sharing their words of wisdom. I think I've learned a great deal tonight, and especially, I love that what AUSA Eastland said, seeing things from all different perspectives and gathering information that way, so that we can make a collaborative decision and a comprehensive decision throughout these entire processes as we look at criminal justice and also as we look at reform. So what I want to do, we have about 10 minutes left, well, my phone says 8 minutes, but my computer says 10. But I do want to say with our 8 o'clock time frame, I did put in the chat, do you have any questions from the audience? I think Professor Floyd or Attorney Floyd is still here, as well as Attorney Hargrove. But do we have any questions from our virtual audience members? I just want to give a chance to take this time to seek any questions. Y'all like it's Friday? It's 8 o'clock. It's time to get out of here. We've had class all day, work all day. Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions, going once, going twice, no takers, I'm going to turn it back over to Sid and thank the BLSA chapter for having us here tonight, particularly myself from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Booker. Always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you also to our panelists, all three of you who are Mercer alum. Got to keep it in the family. So I appreciate all of you coming back to speak with us today. I hope everyone enjoyed it. It has been an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for all the information. If no one else has any other questions, then that is all I have for you all.